The spring sun was rising over the hills of Tuscany when the first cry of Clara Isabella Fornari echoed through the home of the prosperous merchant family. It was the year of our Lord 1603, and no one could have imagined that the dark-haired girl with deep eyes was destined to become known as the bride of Christ's Passion. As the air on that morning of her birth, the elders of the region would later say, carried an unusual fragrance of lilies, a scent that years later would become the unmistakable sign of her presence. 17th century Italy was a land of stark contrasts. On one hand, the artistic splendor of the Renaissance still left its mark on the grand architecture and flourishing arts. On the other, power struggles among noble families, plagues that wiped out entire villages, and recurring famine reminded everyone of the fragility of earthly life. In the midst of this setting, little Clara grew up with an uncommon sensitivity to spiritual matters. In the gardens of the Fornari home, while other children played games and lived out the fantasies of their age, young Clara was often found in silence, contemplating a small crucifix she had received from her grandmother. The household servants would whisper respectfully among themselves about how the girl's eyes seemed to change when fixed on the image of the crucified Christ. They became deep, almost translucent, as if she could see beyond what normal eyes could perceive. "Mummy, why is Jesus bleeding?" she once asked at just 5 years old, gently touching the depiction of the Saviour's wounds with her tiny fingers. Her mother, a woman of traditional but moderate faith, gave a simple explanation of the crucifixion story. What she did not expect was her daughter's reaction. Clara hugged the crucifix to her chest and with tears streaming down her innocent face murmured, "Don't cry, my Jesus. Clara is here. Clara will suffer with you." That was not a childish promise soon forgotten. It was the first sign of a soul called to the extraordinary. Clara's childhood passed between the privileged education her social status afforded and her increasingly frequent moments of prayerful solitude. While she learned literature, music, and embroidery, as was fitting for a young lady of her station, it was in the family chapel that she found true joy. There, kneeling on the cold marble floor, she would lose all sense of time. The sound of birds in the garden blended with the murmur of her prayers, and the scent of candle wax merged with a natural fragrance that, inexplicably, began to emanate from her skin during moments of deep spiritual fervor. The seasons came and went. In the harsh winters, when snow blanketed the Tuscan hills with its silent cloak, Clara was seen walking barefoot through the white-covered garden, gazing at the starry sky. "It's so I can feel a little of his pain," she explained simply when asked about the practice that worried her parents. In the scorching summer heat, she would refuse to drink water for hours, murmuring only, "He was thirsty on the cross." As the girl grew into a young woman, her physical beauty blossomed alongside her devotion. By the age of 15, Clara had become a young lady of rare grace. Her black hair framed a face of delicate features, and her dark eyes held the depth of someone much older. Suitors began to appear, drawn both by her beauty and by her family's position. Much to her parents' distress, however, she remained indifferent to them all. "My heart already belongs to someone," she said firmly, when her father, concerned for her future, mentioned the name of a young nobleman who had shown interest in courting her. "My spouse is the one who bled on the cross for love." Damn! On a stormy night, when Clara turned 17, an extraordinary scene unfolded in the young woman's room. A servant passing by in the hallway was drawn by an unusual light spilling out from under the door. Peeking through the crack, she was left breathless by what she saw. Clara was kneeling in the center of the room, her body slightly lifted off the ground, bathed in a soft glow that came from no candle or lamp. Her arms were extended in the shape of a cross, and her face, turned toward heaven, bore an expression of painful ecstasy. Most striking of all was the intense scent of lilies that filled the room, so strong it spread throughout the corridor. The next morning, Clara announced her unshakable decision. She would enter the Poor Clares Convent in the neighboring city. Her parents, who had witnessed the signs of their daughter's extraordinary calling over the years, could not bring themselves to oppose her. Clara's arrival at the Poor Clares Convent did not go unnoticed. As she crossed the gates of the austere stone building, the bells began to ring on their own, even though it was not time for prayer. The older sisters exchanged meaningful glances. One of them, Sister Angelica, over 70 years old and known for her wisdom, whispered to the abbess, "The one we saw in our dreams has arrived, the one who will bear the invisible wounds." Clara's novitiate was marked by an almost supernatural adjustment to religious life. While other novices struggled with the strict schedules, the simplicity of the food, or the harshness of the chores, Clara seemed to flourish amid the deprivations. Her delicate body, which had never known physical labor, now bent to scrub the stone floors, carried heavy buckets of water, and worked in the convent garden with an energy that amazed everyone. "It's as if she doesn't feel tired," one sister commented to the novice mistress, who replied thoughtfully, "It's not that she doesn't feel it, it's that she's turned her exhaustion into prayer." The moment of taking the habit was the first public event that revealed to the local community the emerging sanctity of the young woman. As Clara pronounced her vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, witnesses reported seeing a small crown of light above her head. The bishop presiding over the ceremony paused his words for a moment, visibly impacted by something he saw, but chose not to comment on at the time. Later in his personal journal, discovered after his death, he would write, "Today I saw the Spirit of God descend like a dove upon the head of the novice Clara Fornari, now Sister Clare of the Cross. Her eyes, at the moment of consecration, were no longer human but windows into the divine. Thus began, in truth, the extraordinary journey of the one who would become known as Saint Clare of the Cross, the bride of Christ's passion. And the world was not yet prepared for the miracles that would come through her hands, marked by wounds invisible to the naked eye, but profoundly real in the mystery of divine economy." Clare's early years in the convent were marked by a spiritual deepening that amazed even the most experienced nuns. While most had to strive to maintain focus during the long hours of prayer, Clare seemed to dwell on another plane, as if her soul had already found a direct path to the heart of the divine. The Poor Clares Convent of Santa Maria degli Angeli was known in the region for its austerity. Perched atop a hill with thick stone walls that kept the interior cool in summer and freezing in winter, the place demanded of its nuns a physical and spiritual toughness that few naturally possessed. Silence was nearly perpetual, broken only by liturgical chants, brief necessary communications for daily tasks, and a single hour of recreation permitted after dinner. For Clare, however, that silence was like music. In silence, she would write years later in one of her few preserved writings, "I hear the voice of my beloved whispering secrets that physical ears cannot perceive. Each strike of the bell, marking the hours, is like a kiss from God upon the soul that watches in longing." It was during one night of adoration that the first of the mystical phenomena that would mark her life occurred. Clare was kneeling in the cold chapel, illuminated only by the faint light of the sanctuary lamp. It was winter, and the cold penetrated to the bone. Most of the elderly sisters had been excused from that particular vigil, but Clare, then 20 years old, had insisted on staying. The abbess, Mother Teresa, passing through the chapel to ensure everything was in order, found Clare in a state of deep ecstasy. Her body was motionless, kneeling, but completely rigid. Her arms were stretched out in the form of a cross, and her face, turned upward, bore an expression that was impossible to describe, a mix of intense pain and sublime joy. Most extraordinary, however, was that the temperature around Clare was notably warmer, as if an invisible fire surrounded her, pushing away the biting cold of the night. Mother Teresa, a prudent and experienced woman, chose not to disturb the young nun from that state. Quietly, she withdrew and recorded the event in the convent's journal, adding, "If not for fear of superstition, I would say that today I witnessed a soul being visited by God Himself." That was only the beginning. In the following months, Clare began to experience what theologians would later classify as invisible stigmata. During meditations on the Passion of Christ, especially on Fridays, she felt sharp pains in her hands, feet, and side, precisely where Jesus had been nailed and pierced. Although no visible marks appeared on her body, the intensity of the pain was such that at times she could not hold objects or walk. Curiously, during these moments of greatest suffering, the scent of lilies, already associated with her presence, became so strong that it spread throughout the entire convent. Some nuns reported that merely sensing the fragrance was enough for them to know that Clare was experiencing one of her mystical episodes. "It's as if heaven wants to balance the pain with beauty," once remarked young Sister Lucia, a newly arrived novice, assigned to assist Clare on the days when her suffering prevented her from performing normal duties. News of these extraordinary phenomena did not take long to spread. First within the convent, then throughout the town, and eventually across the entire region. The local bishop, Dom Alessandro, a man of solid theological formation and a natural skepticism towards supposed miracles, decided to investigate the case personally. He arrived at the convent unannounced on a Friday, precisely when Clare's stigmata were expected to manifest more intensely. The encounter between the bishop and Clare took place in the convent's small visiting room, a simple space with only a crucifix on the wall, a plain wooden table, and a few hard benches. Clare entered the room, supported by two sisters, her pale face in stark contrast to the dark habit. Upon seeing the bishop, she knelt with difficulty, trying to kiss his ring in a sign of respect. "Rise, sister," said Dom Alessandro with a firm voice. "I have not come to receive reverence, but to discern the truth." The interrogation that followed was rigorous. The bishop questioned Clare about her experiences, her theological understanding, her life of prayer, and above all, the possibility that everything was merely overactive imagination or worse, a deliberate attempt to gain a reputation for holiness. Clare answered everything with disarming simplicity. There was no rehearsed eloquence in her words, only the bare truth of someone who does not know how to lie. When the bishop asked about the pain of the stigmata, she responded with her eyes lowered. "Your Excellency, I don't know how to explain what happens to me. I only know that when I meditate on the Passion, it feels as though my body participates in the suffering I contemplate. I didn't ask for this, nor do I consider myself worthy. If it is your Excellency's will that I ask God to take away this grace or this burden, I will do so with complete obedience." It was at that moment that something unexpected happened. Clara, who was seated before the bishop, suddenly brought her hands to her chest as if struck by an invisible blow. Her face contorted with sharp pain, and she collapsed to her knees, unable to remain seated. Then her arms opened involuntarily in the shape of a cross. Dom Alessandro watched, caught between astonishment and skepticism when he felt it. The scent of lilies filled the room with such intensity that it was almost tangible. It didn't come from any identifiable source. It seemed to emanate from the very air around them. And then, even more extraordinary, the bishop became aware that the wounds in his own heart, not physical ones, but spiritual, the doubts that had haunted him about his vocation, the weariness of years of service to the church, the loneliness of his position, seemed to be touched by an invisible hand. When Clara finally emerged from that state, about 20 minutes later, Dom Alessandro was no longer the same man who had entered the room. With tears in his eyes, something exceedingly rare for that prelate known for his firmness, he murmured, "Forgive me, daughter. I came to test your holiness, and it was my faith that ended up being tested." That same day, the bishop wrote a detailed report to be sent to the Vatican, affirming his conviction that the phenomena experienced by Clara were genuine. He concluded the document with prophetic words: "I believe that, through this humble religious sister, God wishes to remind the world that the suffering of Christ is not a story of the past, but a living reality that continues to redeem souls." The news of the little saint of the stigmata, as Clara came to be known among the simple folk of the region, began to attract pilgrims. People of all social classes sought out the convent, eager for a word, a blessing, or simply the chance to be in the presence of one whom they said bore the marks of Christ. The abbess, concerned about the impact this attention could have on the community life and on Clara's humility, made a prudent decision. Clara would be partially secluded, receiving only those visitors authorized by the bishop, and only for brief periods. The rest of her time would be dedicated to prayer and the simplest tasks of the convent, especially caring for the garden's flowers, a duty for which she showed a special talent. "Flowers," Clara would say to her fellow sisters, "are God's smiles on earth. Each one is proof that even from mud and manure, beauty and fragrance can arise when touched by divine grace." The analogy was no coincidence. Clara was beginning to understand that her own life followed the same pattern. It was in the soil of humiliation and the manure of suffering that her union with Christ blossomed. It was when the pain was greatest that her love was deepest. And this paradox, central to Christianity, yet so difficult to grasp intellectually, became vivid and tangible through her experience. By the age of 25, Clara had already become a transformative figure within the convent. Without seeking position or authority, she had become a spiritual reference for all the nuns, including the abbess herself, who often sought her out in secret for advice or prayers during difficult times. It was around this time that the first reports of miraculous healings associated with her intercession began to surface. The winter of 1629 was particularly harsh in the Tuscan region. A series of snowstorms, followed by devastating frosts, ravaged the land, and famine began to threaten the local communities. The Poor Clares Convent, always frugal, now faced the real prospect of scarcity. The granaries were nearly empty, and the severity of the winter made new planting impossible. It was in this context that the first major public miracle attributed to Clara occurred, when she was 26 years old. One morning, after morning prayer, she approached the abbess with an unusual proposal. "Mother, I ask permission to plant roses in the garden." Mother Teresa looked at Clara as if she hadn't understood her words. Through the narrow window of the abbess's office, one could see the garden blanketed in thick snow, with leafless trees bowing under the weight of ice. "Roses. Now, sister, perhaps the fever from your sufferings has clouded your judgment," the abbess replied, both worried and incredulous. Clara smiled with that serenity that seemed to come from another world. "It is not madness, Mother. Last night in prayer, I understood that we must trust more in divine providence. The roses will bloom, and with them, the help we need will come." Something in Clara's gaze, that calm certainty that radiated from her eyes, led the abbess, against all reason, to grant the permission requested. "Do as you wish, sister, but don't expose yourself too much to the cold, or we'll have another sick one to care for." That same morning, the sisters of the convent witnessed an extraordinary scene through the window. Clara, kneeling in the snow, was digging the frozen garden soil with her bare hands. The biting wind lashed her face, but she seemed oblivious to the discomfort. For hours, she worked without rest, preparing a large circular bed in the center of the garden. When she finished, she returned to the chapel and spent the rest of the day in deep prayer. Some sisters reported seeing her in ecstasy, her face radiant as if lit from within, murmuring words that seemed to be part of an intimate conversation with someone invisible. The next morning, a Sunday, the miracle revealed itself in all its glory. Where there had been only turned soil and a few small green sprouts the day before, now stood a magnificent rose garden in full bloom. Red roses, dozens of them, large and fragrant, defied the winter with their exuberant beauty. The convent bell rang out frantically, calling all the sisters to witness the wonder. Clara, however, was not present to see the impact of her miracle. They found her in the chapel, prostrate before the altar, so absorbed in prayer that she seemed unaware of the world around her. News of the miracle of the roses spread quickly throughout the town. The bishop was called to verify the event in person, and even the most skeptical were forced to bow to the evidence. In the midst of a harsh winter, a garden of roses had bloomed, releasing not only the characteristic scent of those flowers, but also that now familiar fragrance of lilies associated with Clara's presence. But the miracle of the roses was only the beginning. In the days that followed, something even more extraordinary happened. Pilgrims began arriving from all directions to see the miraculous garden. Many, moved by generosity in response to the marvel, brought donations of food, cloth, and other needed supplies. Within a few weeks, the convent that had been facing hunger saw its storerooms full again, with even surplus to share with the poor of the region. Through roses that should not exist, God provided the bread we needed, wrote the abbess in her journal, adding with awe. And the most extraordinary part is that while everything around remains under winter's grip, the entire convent garden now blooms as if we were in the height of spring. Indeed, from the rosebed Clara had planted, life seemed to radiate in widening circles. First, the medicinal herbs in the small convent garden turned green again. Then the fruit trees in the orchard, normally dormant in winter, began to show buds. In less than a month, the Poor Clares Convent had become an oasis of lush fertility in a world still dominated by frost. The implications of this phenomenon did not go unnoticed by the theologians and church authorities sent to investigate. When Monsignor, after thoroughly examining the roses and confirming they were perfectly natural, not artificial or transplanted from greenhouses, declared, "This garden is living proof that true faith can alter even the laws of nature." Here we see made visible the verse from the prophet Isaiah, "The desert and the parched land will be glad. The wilderness will rejoice and blossom like the rose." For Clara, however, the meaning of the miracle was far simpler and more personal. When she finally agreed to speak about it, she said only, "The roses are Jesus' answer to my small act of trust." He wanted to show that just as he made roses bloom in winter, he can make hope sprout in hearts hardened by the cold of suffering. This interpretation revealed much about Clara's spirituality. For her, miracles were never an end in themselves or displays of power. They were always signs, divine language to communicate deeper truths, invitations to love and to trust. After this event, Clara began to be sought out by people not only in search of physical healing, but also for spiritual consolation. Souls tormented by doubt, hearts wounded by betrayal, spirits weighed down by old guilt, all seemed to find peace in the presence of that young nun, whose eyes reflected compassion without judgment. One particularly notable case was that of Lorenzo, a young soldier who had returned from war with his body intact, but his soul shattered by the horrors he had witnessed and the atrocities he had committed. Haunted by nightmares and unable to find peace, he had attempted suicide twice before being brought, almost by force, to the Poor Clares Convent. The meeting between Lorenzo and Clara took place in the convent's visiting parlor, a room divided by a grille where cloistered nuns could receive visitors. On one side of the grate sat the young soldier with empty eyes and trembling hands. On the other, Clara, in her simple habit and that scent of lilies that seemed to follow her like a luminous shadow. "I can't live with what I've done," Lorenzo confessed after a long silence. "The faces of the men I killed haunt me. The cries of the women and children I couldn't save echo in my ears even when I'm awake. If there's a hell, sister, I'm already in it." Clara listened silently, her eyes fixed on his, as if she could see beyond his words to the very core of his pain. Then, without saying a word, she reached her hand through the grate. Lorenzo, hesitant, reached out his own. The moment their fingers touched, something extraordinary happened. Later, the young man would describe the experience in these words. "It was as if a stream of cool water flowed from her into me, washing every dark corner of my soul. I saw all my sins parade before my eyes, but not with horror. It was as if each one was presented to Christ and immersed in his blood. I felt the weight of years lifted from my shoulders, and for the first time since returning from war, I could breathe without pain." When the experience ended, Lorenzo wept like a child, but they were tears of relief, not despair. Clara, for her part, looked exhausted, as if she had fought an invisible battle. Her final words to the soldier before he left, transformed, were, "What has been washed in the blood of Christ can no longer be claimed by darkness. Go in peace and let your restored life be a testimony to the mercy you've received." Lorenzo not only found inner peace, but became an active agent of reconciliation in his community. He founded a shelter for war veterans and dedicated the rest of his life to helping other men who, like him, bore invisible wounds far more painful than any physical injury. This was just one of many cases of soul healing attributed to Clara's intercession. As her reputation for holiness spread, the number of people seeking her counsel and prayers grew exponentially. The abbess, concerned about the impact of this demand on Clara's already fragile health and the convent's routine, had to establish strict limits for visits. Clara accepted these restrictions with the same serenity with which she accepted everything in her life, as an expression of the divine will manifested through religious obedience. "It doesn't matter how many souls I can comfort personally," she would say. "What matters is how much love I put into praying for each one of them, even those I'll never meet face to face." This attitude revealed a deep truth about her spirituality. For Clara, the effectiveness of her apostolate did not depend on visible external actions, but on the intensity of her union with the crucified Christ. It was in that mystical union, cultivated in the silence and solitude of her convent cell, that she found the inexhaustible source of grace that overflowed to others. The year 1631 would mark a new phase in Clara's spiritual life. During a particularly intense Holy Week, after 3 days of strict fasting and continuous prayer, she received what many mystics consider the ultimate form of identification with Christ: the visible stigmata. It happened in the early hours of Good Friday. Clara was alone in the convent chapel, immersed in contemplation of the Passion, when she felt a searing pain in her hands, feet, and side, pain that was familiar to her, as she had for years experienced the invisible stigmata. This time, however, something was different. The intensity of the suffering was so great that she lost consciousness. When the sacristan entered the chapel at dawn, she found Clara lying on the floor, unconscious, with bloodstains on her habit. Alarmed, she immediately called the abbess and other sisters. When they removed the wide sleeves of her habit and her thick stockings, what they saw left them in reverent shock. In the center of Clara's palms and on the tops of her feet were open, round wounds, resembling those that would be caused by large nails. On the right side of her chest, visible through a tear in her habit, a long wound bled profusely. "It's a miracle," murmured the abbess, falling to her knees. "It's a trial sent by God," she added, tears streaming down her wrinkled face. Clara was carefully taken to the convent infirmary. The local physician, Dr. Alessandri, a man of both science and faith, was called to examine the wounds. After a thorough examination, he stepped away from the bedside with a pale face and trembling hands. "In 30 years of medicine, I've never seen anything like this," he told the abbess. "These wounds should cause unbearable pain, possibly even risk of death by infection, yet they are clean, as if some invisible force is keeping them that way. And the most extraordinary thing, when I try to stop the bleeding, the blood flows gently again, without clotting." News of Clara's visible stigmata quickly spread beyond the convent walls. Within days, hundreds of pilgrims were gathering at the gates, begging to see the living saint who bleeds like Christ. No, the bishop, aware of the need for caution, sent a commission of theologians and physicians to investigate the phenomenon. For weeks, Clara was subjected to rigorous examinations. Her wounds were observed, measured, and documented. Skeptical doctors attempted to explain the phenomenon as the result of autosuggestion or even deliberate self-infliction. Conservative theologians warned against overly emotional devotions. But no one could explain how the wounds, which never became infected or healed, reopened and bled precisely at 3 o'clock on Friday afternoons, the traditional hour of Christ's death. "It's as if time itself bends in these moments," wrote one of the doctors in his report, "as if this woman crosses the centuries to stand at Calvary, not as a spectator, but as a participant." Clara, for her part, had only one request: that her wounds be kept secret, covered by bandages and gloves. Not out of shame or fear, she explained, but because these marks are not for display, but for union with the redemptive suffering of Christ. The abbess, however, quickly realized that the phenomenon of the stigmata had implications beyond Clara's personal experience. On one hand, it attracted unwanted attention to the convent, disrupting the community's contemplative life. On the other hand, it presented a unique opportunity for evangelization at a time when the Catholic faith was facing challenges from both the growing Protestant movement and emerging rationalism. After consulting with the bishop, a middle ground decision was reached. Clara would be partially secluded in a small cell adjoining the convent chapel with a barred window facing the outside. There, on specific days and times, the faithful could see her in prayer, receive her blessing, and present their petitions. At the same time, she would continue to participate in the convent's communal life, though with some adaptations due to her increasingly fragile physical condition. This arrangement, which in practice made Clara a recluse without separating her completely from the community, proved to be providential. Through that small barred window, thousands of people would receive words of wisdom, spiritual comfort, and in many cases, physical healings that defied medical explanation. Such was the case with Bianca, an 8-year-old girl who had been born blind. Her parents, after making pilgrimages to famous shrines in search of a miracle, had finally come to the Poor Clares Convent with little hope left. As they approached the window where Clara received visitors, the girl suddenly stirred in her father's arms. "I smell flowers," exclaimed Bianca, lifting her face toward Clara. "It's so beautiful." "Yes, little one," Clara replied with that gentle voice that seemed to caress the soul. "They're lilies, the fragrance of God's flowers." Then Clara reached her hand through the grill and gently touched the closed eyes of the girl. "He who opened the eyes of the man born blind can, if it is his will, open yours too." What happened next was witnessed by dozens of people. Bianca began blinking rapidly, as if exposed to a bright light. Her pupils, once fixed and clouded, began to move. Then, with a cry of joy, the little girl exclaimed, "I see! Mommy, Daddy, I see you!" The doctors who examined Bianca after the event confirmed that her eyes, previously completely atrophied, were now functioning perfectly. There was no scientific explanation for the instant recovery of organs that had never properly developed. This was just the first in a series of healing miracles attributed to Clara's intercession. Paralyzed people walked again, the deaf recovered their hearing, tumors vanished without a trace, and in every case, those who were healed reported the same experience. As they approached Clara, they were surrounded by that supernatural fragrance of lilies, felt an unexplainable warmth flow through their bodies, and suddenly they were healed. But Clara insisted, "It is not I who heals. It is Christ who works through this poor servant. And he does not heal everyone the same way, because he sees what we truly need, not just what we think we need." Indeed, many who sought physical healing left Clara's presence still burdened by their illnesses, but with renewed inner peace and a serene acceptance of their suffering. "She didn't heal my body, but she saved my soul," said a man who had arrived at the convent consumed by hatred because of the disease that disfigured him, and left reconciled with his condition. In 1633, when Clara turned 30, a new mystical phenomenon began to manifest: levitation. During ecstasy, her body would rise from the ground, sometimes remaining suspended more than a meter in the air for extended periods. Although it happened mostly during private prayer, there were occasions when the phenomenon occurred during convent mass, in front of the entire community. "It's as if her body tries to follow where her soul already is," commented one of the novices after witnessing Clara levitate during Eucharistic adoration. The abbess, always vigilant against unhealthy curiosity and sensationalism regarding mystical gifts, adopted a posture of discreet observation. When levitation occurred in public, she would simply ask the sisters to continue with their normal duties, without comment or interruption. In her journal, however, she carefully recorded each occurrence, aware that she was witnessing an extraordinary chapter in the spiritual history of her time. Clara, for her part, was embarrassed by these phenomena. "I don't want to be a spectacle," she confided to the abbess. "I only want to be a clay vessel in the hands of the divine potter." Her concern came from a deep awareness that mystical gifts, no matter how extraordinary, were never an end in themselves. They were instruments for the mission God had entrusted to her, to be a visible channel of Christ's compassion in a world marked by suffering and despair. That mission became especially evident during the terrible plague that struck the region in the summer of 1635. The epidemic, believed by some historians to have been a typhus outbreak, devastated entire cities, leaving a trail of death and desolation in its wake. The Poor Clares Convent, isolated on its hilltop, remained initially untouched by the disease, but Clara found no peace knowing that beyond the convent walls, so many were suffering without comfort. One night during intense prayer, she received what she would later describe as a calling within the calling, the conviction that she must leave the safety of the cloister to serve the sick and the dying. Knowing that such a decision required special dispensation from her vow of enclosure, Clara humbly but confidently presented her request to the abbess, with the quiet certainty of one who knows the divine will. Mother Teresa, after consulting the bishop, granted the requested permission, though her heart was heavy with concern over the risk Clara would face by exposing herself to the contagion. "Go with God, my daughter," said the abbess, as she bid her farewell. "But remember that your life is also precious, and that your place among us cannot be filled by another." For 2 months, Clara worked tirelessly among the plague-stricken. Unafraid of infection, she cared for the sick, comforted the dying, and buried the abandoned dead. Her stigmata, which continued to bleed regularly, became for many a visible sign of Christ's compassionate presence in the midst of collective suffering. What was most extraordinary, however, was the effect of her presence in places of affliction, Wherever Clara went, the air seemed to purify. The fetid stench characteristic of the disease was replaced by the fragrance of lilies that emanated from her person. Patients who had lost consciousness briefly regained lucidity at her touch, allowing them to make a final confession or say goodbye to loved ones. "She is not just a nurse, she is a living sacrament," commented a local priest who worked alongside Clara in the makeshift hospitals. Through her, the dying experienced divine mercy in a tangible way. When the epidemic finally subsided, Clara returned to the convent physically exhausted but spiritually radiant. Against all odds, she had not contracted the disease, despite having had direct contact with hundreds of infected individuals. This fact was regarded by many as yet another miracle associated with her. Returning to convent life after such an intense experience among the plague victims was not easy. Clara entered a period that mystics refer to as the Dark Night, a state of apparent spiritual abandonment where the divine presence, once so palpable, seemed to have completely withdrawn. For months, she experienced no ecstasies or levitations. Her stigmata continued to bleed, but without the interior consolation that had once accompanied the phenomenon. "I am in the desert, Mother," she confided to the abbess, "but it doesn't matter. I've learned that to love is not to feel, but to will the good of the beloved above all, even when he seems absent." It was during this time of spiritual dryness that Clara wrote her only known book, Reflections on the Passion of Christ. Unlike other mystical writings filled with visions and extraordinary revelations, Clara's work stood out for its stripped-down simplicity and profound identification with the suffering Christ. "On the cross," she wrote, "God showed us that there is no love without pain. Whoever loves suffers. Whoever loves deeply suffers deeply. And whoever loves to the end like Christ suffers to the end. But this suffering, far from being a curse, is the greatest proof of love a human being can offer." The original manuscript, written in red ink, which some claimed was her own stigmata blood, quickly became a spiritual treasure for the community. Copies were made and circulated among monasteries and convents, inspiring many souls to a deeper devotion to Christ's passion. In the winter of 1639, when she turned 36, Clara began to show the first signs that her earthly journey was nearing its end. Her strength visibly declined, and she spent more and more time in silent prayer, as if already preparing for the final encounter with the beloved. On a particularly cold night in January of 1640, Clara called the abbess to her cell and said with serenity, "My hour is near, Mother. Before I go, I would like to ask 3 things: that my body be buried without pomp in an anonymous grave, that my wounds be covered before burial so no one sees them, and that the small crucifix I received from my grandmother be buried with me." The abbess, with tears in her eyes, promised to honor each request, adding, "But you won't leave us so soon, my daughter. We still need you here." Clara smiled with that expression that seemed to light her face from within. "We are all needed, Mother, but no one is indispensable in the divine plan. My mission here is nearly complete. But don't worry, I will continue interceding for all my sisters and for all those seeking comfort, only from a different place." 2 weeks later, on a Friday morning, Clara received the last sacraments. Her strength was nearly gone, but her eyes shone with a supernatural light. Gathered around her bed, the sisters of the convent witnessed her final mystical experience. Shortly before 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the hour of Christ's death, Clara suddenly rose from her bed, extended her arms in the form of a cross, and exclaimed in a clear, strong voice, "Behold, he comes! My beloved comes to take her." At that moment, the scent of lilies that had always accompanied her grew so intense that some sisters later reported struggling to breathe. The winter sunlight, streaming through the narrow cell window, seemed to gather around Clara, enveloping her in a golden halo. Then, with a gentle sigh, she closed her eyes and gave up her spirit. It was exactly 3 o'clock. Immediately after her death, something extraordinary happened. The stigmata, which had bled constantly for years, closed completely, leaving only delicate, perfectly circular scars. Her body, worn by suffering and deprivation, transformed. Her skin took on a translucent glow, and the features marked by pain softened, revealing a serene beauty that many compared to a sleeping young woman. "She didn't die," whispered one of the novices. "She blossomed." Clara's funeral, despite her request for simplicity, became an event that drew crowds. The humble people of the region, who had considered her a saint long before any official recognition, insisted on paying their final respects. The bishop, recognizing the spiritual magnitude of what Clara represented, authorized that her body be displayed in the convent church for 3 days before burial. During those 3 days, thousands of people passed by the simple wooden coffin where Clara lay, dressed in her dark habit with her hands covered by white gloves to conceal the stigmata, as she had requested. The scent of lilies emanating from her body was so intense it could be smelled from miles away, drawing even more pilgrims. On the day of the burial, as the coffin was finally closed and carried in procession to the small convent cemetery, what many considered her final living miracle occurred. Though it was February, the coldest month of winter, the path along which the funeral procession passed bloomed spontaneously with white lilies sprouting from the frozen earth. "The lilies of heaven came to fetch the flower of the earth," said an elderly woman from the town, expressing in simple words the shared certainty that what they had witnessed was not merely a funeral, but a glorification. In the years following Clara's death, her reputation for holiness grew exponentially. Reports of miracles and graces attributed to her intercession multiplied, not only in Italy, but throughout Catholic Europe. Her tomb, though simple and discreet as she had requested, became a center of pilgrimage. In 1662, just 22 years after her death, an extraordinarily short period for that era, Pope Alexander VII initiated the process of Clara's beatification. Witnesses were heard, miracles were investigated, and her writings were carefully examined for any doctrinal deviation. The process culminated with her canonization in 1681, when Pope Innocent XV solemnly declared, "Clare of the Cross, whose very name foretold her destiny of union with the crucified Christ, is now officially recognized as what she has always been in the eyes of God, a saint whose life was a living gospel of divine mercy." Today, more than 4 centuries after her birth, Saint Clare of the Cross continues to inspire the faithful around the world. Her convent, preserved as a living relic of her time on earth, is said by sensitive pilgrims to still exude, on certain spring mornings, that familiar lily fragrance, the sign of her presence. But her most enduring legacy does not lie in the extraordinary mystical phenomena that marked her life, nor even in the miracles attributed to her intercession. It lies in the central message that her entire existence proclaimed, that suffering, when united with Christ's out of love, becomes fruitful, that wounds, when offered in faith, can become sources of healing for others, and that true holiness does not consist in spectacular feats, but in daily fidelity to the divine will. As she herself wrote in her Reflections, "We are not called to do great things, but to put great love into the small things we do. And when love is great enough, even the smallest gesture becomes a miracle in the eyes of God." Saint Clare of the Cross, the bride of the Passion, the flower that bloomed on the cross, continues to perfume the Church and the world with her example of total love, reminding us all that even in the darkest nights of suffering, it is possible to bloom like roses in winter. Prayer. O Saint Clare of the Cross, faithful bride of the crucified, teach me to love with purity, to suffer with hope, and to serve with humility. Unite my sorrows to the wounds of Christ, transform my struggles into offerings of love, and make my soul an altar of silence and faith. Intercede for me that I may find peace in the cross, comfort in prayer, and strength to walk with Jesus to the very end. Amen. My prayer, O Lord our God, with hearts lifted in gratitude, we thank you for the gift of life and for the privilege of carrying forward your love through stories that inspire and transform. We thank you, Father, for granting us strength, wisdom, and courage to share the teachings of your gospel through this channel, which has been a beacon of hope and light amid the world's adversities. Lord, we acknowledge that every life is a precious gift, and we are grateful for each moment we are given to witness and proclaim your word. May every story told, every message of faith, and every divine teaching reach hearts thirsty for love, truth, and reconciliation. We thank you for the inspiration that guides us, for the blessings that multiply, and for the opportunity to contribute to the spread of Christianity, bringing the light of your love to those seeking direction and comfort. May these narratives touch lives, strengthen faith, and build a community united in the search for peace and the truth that only you can offer. May your grace continue to shine upon us, and may we be instruments of your mercy and compassion, reflecting the beauty of your love in every word and action. In the name of Jesus, our Savior, we thank you for allowing us to take part in this sacred mission. Amen. At the end of this moving journey through the life of Saint Clare of the Cross, one truth echoes in the hearts of all who came to know her. Love, lived in silence, has the power to transform the world. Her story is not merely one of suffering, but of hope, surrender, and unshakable faith. A soul hidden within cloistered walls, yet revealed to heaven, Clare became a living flame of Christ's passion. If this story touched your heart, subscribe now to the channel Sacred Stories. Leave a like and share it with someone who needs comfort and faith. Your support helps this mission of bringing light to souls longing for God. And now we want to hear from you. When in your life did you feel God sustaining you in your pain as He sustained Saint Clare? Tell us in the comments. Your story could inspire someone else. And don't go just yet. Watch one of the videos that appears here above. It was chosen especially for you. See you in the next story.